All right, everybody, welcome to today's webinar. We're covering a new topic today for our online classes. We're going to be talking about plants that are at the edge of the growing zone. So I'm excited to hear about this topic. I know this is one that we have gotten a good number of requests for, so I'm glad that Paul's able to join us today. Before we get started, I'm just watching the numbers go up as people log in, so we will give everybody a second to get dialed in. While we're doing that, I'm going to go over a few housekeeping notes for those of you who are new, and as always, for those of you who join us regularly, welcome back, and just bear with me for the next couple minutes. For those of you who have done Zoom meetings before, this is a little bit different. It's a Zoom webinar, so we can't actually see you or hear you during this class. Instead, if you have a question, then you can send that to us via the Q&A box that's on your Zoom menu. I'll be monitoring that during the class, and we're going to hold questions until the end of the class today. So I'll be giving those to Paul at the end. And we are recording today. If you need to leave early, we'll be sending a link following the class. Usually it takes about 24 hours with a link to the recording. So just know that. I think that about covers it. I'm checking chat now to make sure if anybody has any issues, they can send me a chat. All right, you guys are all set. So please feel free to send me a chat if you have any issues during the class. I'll be happy to address those, and just let us know if you have any questions. Quick introduction for those of you who don't know Paul. Paul works primarily at our Fair Oaks store with our trees and shrubs. He has been an instructor for our in-person classes, but this is his first online class, so I'm very excited to have him today. Paul, you kind of know a lot about a little bit of everything, so I'm looking forward to hearing from you today. And I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you. Please feel free to tell them a little bit about what you do at Fair Oaks, and we'll get started.
Okay, hello everybody. As said, Paul Mclean. I've been here now 19 years. Came from California, Fremont area. I worked in nurseries there and down in San Diego. Very nice to work here. And so I do know, I'm always the guy that they ask for, like, hey, Paul, what's this tropical plant or fruit and nuts and stuff. So, but we're going to get going on this seminar here. The last time I did anything like this, it was called television. It's a little box that's kind of like your phone, except really, really big. And so some of you might remember that. So we're going to go with this as a, so we'll go ahead and start with the first slide, our little introduction to ourselves. And so you can see we're talking about borderline plants in 7, use of microclimates and natural and man-made. And so those, what I want to do next is show you our map. This is Virginia, obviously, and I know it's probably going to be hard for you, but you can look it up online, and it tells you about our zones. This is USDA zones. USDA zones breaks up the whole world into 12 zones. In the last few years, they have also added A and B. So we're in 7A, which is colder than 7B. Now, for those of you that are living down close to the water, the Potomac and such, you could be in zone 7B, what that means you're from 10 to 5 degrees. 7A is from 5 to 0. 7 includes all that. And they did that because horticulturists and plant people were noticing that, sorry. Oops. But, as you know, I forgot to turn off my phone. They noticed that plants were zone 7 did fine in 10, 9, 5, but then around 5 or 4, they had problems or even froze out. So that's why they broke it up. I don't know if you can see it, but Loudoun County is also on zone 7, only on the west side. East side is actually zone 6B, which means it gets from 0 to -5. Like I said, I've been here 19 years. In those 19 years, we've only been zone 7 4 years, and that's it. The rest of the time, we've all been about zone 8, which plays into what we're talking about today. The other thing is, when you're looking at your zones wherever you live, no matter what part of the world you're in, if you're closer to one zone, like we're closer, I am close, very close to zone 6. And so you will experience sometimes a little bit more colder weather than if you're in a zone 7 and you're closer to 8 or whichever. So that's the way it goes. So we're going to move on to the next slide. And these are typical coverings that you may use to protect plants when it gets really cold. Hopefully people are actually paying attention to the weather coming up to know what's going on. Our big concern is when we have cold weather, it's consecutive nights. I mean, yes, you want to cover on certain nights, but when we have, like in 2017, here at least, we, at the end of January, December, and for the first 2 weeks in January, we were down below 10 degrees and 5 degrees for consecutive 2 weeks. What happens there is the ground freezes deeper and deeper, and that can be a problem. You can see here it's burlap coverings. And also there's frost blankets that you can, we happen to sell here. We sell some stuff here. And then you can see that some of them have structures. You can use whatever you have, or come in and we can show you some of the stuff we have going on. And this is another example. For those of you who have ever traveled, if you're in this area here, wherever, and traveled north into Pennsylvania, New York in the wintertime, this is many times what you see. You'll wonder why there's these burlap things out in people's yards or whatever. They're traditionally, they'll wrap a lot of their plants, their arborvitae, thujas, their boxwoods and stuff like that to keep the wind off of it. The wrapping is really not for frost protection per se, it is for wind protection. As I mentioned, 2017, we got cold for 2 weeks. The worst of it was we had a constant 35 to 40 mile an hour wind with gusts up to 60 miles an hour. That wind is pulling moisture out of the plant. If the ground is frozen, the plant can't replenish that water. And so the plant winter burns, or we're going to go to a quick myself picture. Sorry. This is kind of an example of what winter burn can look like. Obviously brown leaves, part of them are green. And what it looks like, which is actually what happened, is that it dried out. So now the other thing, I just want to show you some options here. You can buy a product. Oops, can you see that? This is called Harvest Guard. Don't get that confused with something that's called frost blanket or a frost protection. The frost protection frost blanket, that is thicker material than the Harvest Guard. That's going to keep the plant warmer. It lets light through, lets water through, lets a little bit of air, but does keep the temperature up a bit underneath it. And also you saw in the picture burlap. You can use burlap and you can just wrap up, cover your plants, wrap them up. Some people will go ahead and here's a little example. I got a little boxwood and I've actually put a cage around it. And the other thing you can do is take some leaves, as I like it here, and you can stuff them in your cage and wrap it around also. That's also going to do a lot of insulation for you. Speaking of leaves, I've got some samples here. These are maple leaves and they're pretty good. The thing is they tend to compact and stick together. If you ever tried to get maple leaves off of a concrete patio, they'll stick. I don't really like to use these at the base. What I prefer is oak leaves because you can see they're fluffier. If you don't have oak in the area, these are sycamore. I wet these down the other day with a lot of water. You can still see they're real fluffy. Or the dreaded magnolia leaves, which people tend to hate because they drop pretty much all year round. But a lot of times what I like to do is take any of these deferred leaves and put them around the plant, and then maybe even get some oak, maple leaves and put them on top of those fluffy ones which cause insulation. And these help hold those in place, especially if you don't have a cage or wrap them up in burlap. So the other thing you can use is anything you find in your house. There's an old blanket. If you're desperate, you can use a shirt or my favorite hat. You can just put it over the top. The other thing which I didn't have here is I've actually taken a string of lights, Christmas lights, or just a portable lamp, plugged it in on certain plants, and you put them underneath the cover, and that will actually help keep it quite warm inside. Okay, we'll go back to the next slide. onward. Now here, kind of examples of what I was saying, they're using wire, they're using wooden fence type material. I mentioned cloth items. A lot of people use plastic. Any of your cloth items, whatever they happen to be made of, they retain moisture from the interior of the plant and the soil. Plastic will kind of do the same thing, but it also lets heat in like a car. How if you have your windows rolled up in your car, it can really, especially if the sun's out. So I don't usually recommend plastic. If you wrap the plant up first with cloth and then put plastic over it, that's fine too. But plastic's not going to let any moisture in. It can also trap moisture inside. Other thing about plastic is that it transfers heat. If the plastic is touching the plant at all, the cold from the air will go right into the leaf and it can damage your plant that way. At the bottom middle, you'll see it says warning. And what they're doing is they're covering Hydrangea macrophylla, that's your standard pink and blue hydrangea, with a frost cloth. But the tips of your hydrangeas could get rubbed off with that. That is going to be more of a problem in slightly warmer climates where you have to do it. I have found up here that your Hydrangea macrophyllas, generally the tips of your plants don't survive the winter. And so I just recommend waiting till the spring, wait for the new growth, cut out anything that's not growing and let it take off. So we're going to go to the next slide. This is a good example of winter burn. I kind of showed you the live plant. This is a Gardenia. And the thing that I want to stress about the zones, people many times will come in and say, well, gosh, this said this lives in zone 7 and it's dead. Well, it's not dead, it's winter burn. It's kind of like what happens to you if you get sunburned. And so they will say that this plant, even though it looks like this, is still a zone 7 plant because it will recover from this. It'll flush new growth in the springtime and then do what it normally does. I want to caution people also, if you grew up with gardenias or some other plant in a more southern climate or warmer climate, and you expect them to act as if they're in that warmer climate, meaning, oh, my gardenia used to bloom from June all the way until October, where I lived in southern Alabama. Well, it's not going to do that here. It's going to bloom mainly in the summertime because those plants, gardenias and some other plants, require heat to start to grow. And then a lot of people get, they'll get some winter burn and everything else seems to be growing and your gardenia is just sitting there like that. It just looks terrible. Leave it alone. Don't water it. Don't fertilize it. Wait for the heat of the spring, early summer to get that plant activated. You could prune that back and let's make it more compact. Remember, wherever you prune something, it's going to make it grow and bush out. So you could take this plant, wait till spring. You could even wait to see where the new growth comes from. Even if the new growth is coming out on top, if you want it to be bushier, you just prune it down because wherever you cut something, it's going to regrow from. Okay, moving on to the next slide. This is showing you about hydrangeas. And when you look at, it gets confusing because a lot of times when you look at hydrangea tags, some of the hydrangea tags will say, well, this plant will survive down to zone 5. And that's true. And what will happen is the roots will survive and they'll regrow from the top. But if you have the old-fashioned ones that only bloom in the spring, they probably won't bloom for you. But that's where the reblooming ones, like the Endless Summers, and a lot of the City Lines, and a bunch of new varieties coming out that are rebloomers. And in fact, that's where Endless Summer was found, up in Michigan, where it's too cold normally to grow them. But the lady had one in her yard, and it bloomed for every year, but it bloomed a little later than it would normally do because it would freeze down, regrow from the roots, and it would bloom. So as I stated, where I grew up, you can look on the far right and you can actually see a bud at the top of the stem. And that's what I would expect to have happened where I grew up in California, except maybe up in Tahoe and such. But here I have never seen the tips of Hydrangea macrophylla make it through the wintertime. And they look a little bit more like the plant on the far left, where it's pushing growth from down inside. And that's why I tell people on those plants, just wait till spring, get a good inch or 2 of growth on them, and then get in there and cut off everything that's not growing well. I did cover my hydrangeas up at the base, at least, with some leaves to help protect the lower section. And the more wood that's left from last year, the more flowers you're going to have on your hydrangea. Right. Here it's just talking about the reason you put mulch at the base of your plants that you're concerned about. You wait until we've got some good freezing temperatures going on, because if you put the mulch on too early in the fall, it keeps the ground too warm, the plant too warm, and it'll actually start to grow under the mulch. So you do want to wait. So in this area in Northern Virginia, probably wait until late December, because we still have pretty warm temperatures. The ground is still warm from the fall. You want to wait till that ground cools down quite a bit. Then you can put the mulch on there. Again, I grew up in a little town called Biggs. I was high school, and we had what people call geraniums. And we had a 15-foot hedge that was 3 feet tall. And every year, what we do is pile oak leaves up and around it, on top of it. And it survived every year, except the year it went down to 13 degrees for about 5 days. And out of that 15 feet, only 2 little plants survived. But by keeping the ground from freezing, that helped that plant make it through the wintertime. You do want to take that mulch away in the spring. You want to do it nice and slow and gentle, because a lot of times the plant has started to grow at the base underneath the mulch. So as you pull the mulch away, if you see some new growth popping up, stop pulling the mulch away. Let those new leaves, which are probably not green because they etiolated in the darkness of the mulch, to get a little sunlight, get green, and then work your way down over the next course of a few days or a week to get more and more of the mulch away. And going down to bare earth, especially for these plants that were sort of on the borderline, they do like heat in the soil. So by removing the mulch eventually down to bare earth, that sunlight will warm up that soil and get that plant activated for you the way you want it to grow. Now I'm just going to show you some examples of plants that we consider sort of borderline. This is Loropetalum chinensis, called French flower. The original form was green with white flowers, and they found all these, the purple leafed ones and all kinds, and they come in all heights. As you can see, 1 to 10 feet. In the south, some of them are even trees. I had one here on the ground for a while, and it would expect it. I always tell people, expect it to lose the leaves. And that's okay, because what happens in the springtime is the first thing it does, you can see the little pink flowers, there's no competition from the burgundy leaf. And so it looks like a pink forsythia. But again, it requires heat for that to activate. So it might be bare clear into April, and you think it's dead, and it's not. You can always go out and scrape the bark off the branch to see if it's green underneath. If so, just leave it alone. It should flush right back up again. Again, like I said, in April, if you did mulching, or if there's any mulch, if you remove all that mulch in April and get down to bare earth, that's going to help heat up the soil and get that plant more activated. All right, moving on to the next slide. Gardenias are a favorite for a lot of people. This particular one is one of my favorites because it's crown jewel. It is rated as zone 6. So that means that's great. One thing I want to remind people, if you're going to grow things in containers, don't care what they are, you do want to go at least 1 zone colder than your zone. So here in zone 7, if you're growing something in containers outside, you want to go, that plant should be able to go at least to zone 6. The reason for that is your pot freezes just like an ice cube. It's not freezing just from the top like the soil, it's freezing from all 6 sides. And the more consecutive nights that it's cold, the deeper that it can freeze, and you eventually get a solid frozen ball. And that's why it's important. I like to move my plants that are potted like that closer to the house, because up against the house, there's less wind, there's a little residual heat, and it's easier to cover them if you need to. I've seen gardenias here, over here. People know where Fair Oaks, for Lake Shopping Center is. There's gardenias over there. They've been there for 20 years. And they did get hit in 17. They burned a bit, but they just flushed right back out again. They're living on natural rainfall. That's the other thing about gardenias, is that people overwater them all the time. You should be aware of how much rainfall your area gets. We get an average around 30, definitely 30, 35 to 40 inches of rain here. Once your plants are established, they generally don't need to be watered anymore. I always get frustrated when I hear someone's been watering their native dogwood tree for the last 7 years, a couple times a week. Why would you water a native plant after it's established? So you don't need to water them much at all after they're established. Next slide just shows you that, yes, we do carry gardenias, and they range anywhere from a couple of feet off the ground to up at 4 or 5 feet high. So you do have a wide choice to go from. The next one is one that a lot of people aren't familiar with. This is called Indian Hawthorne. not hawthorn, but it's a little bush, and it gets white to pink flowers in the springtime. And again, it likes the heat. There's been a lot of breeding in the south on this plant. It's used out west a lot where it's drier, and the south it's got leaf spot, but they've bred new varieties for the south. That's why this is called Georgia Petite, and it has a lot less disease issues. They do produce a little berry, as you can see right there. It does turn blue. Don't eat them. Please don't eat them. And the next slide shows you what they can look like when they're bigger. But also, sorry, the deer do like this plant. I found that out this winter on the two that are in the ground here. I wondered, see, it didn't get that cold. How come the leaves are gone? And I realized, oh, yep, the deer ate them. The next one, this is a fairly new plant for this area too. It's called the Stillium. It's really the witch hazels. And you can see, if you're familiar with witch hazels, you see the little red flowers there. Those are the flowers on the plant. And it's not like, you're not going to stand 20 feet from this plant and go, oh my gosh, my Stillium's in bloom. But it's when you get close to it, you'll see it. You go, oh, that's kind of cute. But again, they ranged from several feet to like the one on the bottom, that's your vintage jade. And the one up the upper corner is called linebacker. It's going to get up like 8 feet or so tall and about 4 to 6 feet wide. So we brought those in mainly because a lot of people have a problem with outer lupin laurels and such. They can be a good replacement. And a lot of them have new growth comes out kind of a copper bronzy tone, so it adds some color during the spring too before they bloom. Again, this is a heat-loving plant to really get it going, kind of like Nandinus. So next slide is one of my favorites is Camellias, and you can see they're zone 7. There are some Camellias that are zone 8 or cooler. We do break Camellias up into spring blooming and fall blooming only, and it does get a little confusing because people look at the tag that came on the plant from the grower, and it says, oh, it blooms in midwinter. And that will happen here if you happen to be in a courtyard in Alexandria or downtown DC, or maybe along the eastern shore someplace. But normally it's too cold here in the wintertime for them to flower, so they just hold off till the spring. Whenever someone's interested in camellias, I recommend fall blooming because best worst case scenario, they get damaged in the wintertime. They just flush out in the springtime, grow, set flower buds, and bloom for you in the fall again. Your spring blooming ones are those you do have to be careful of their buds. The plant will make it through the winters, but sometimes if we get that cold wind and the ground freezes, then the plant will forfeit the buds to save the plant, so it can potentially flower in its future life instead of trying to save a flower bed. So there are people that do wrap those. You want to have these out of the winter wind is preferred. That, like I said, that wind can cause desiccation to the plant. And the camellias, you can prune just about any way you want. You would prune them in the spring after they bloom. They can be used as a hedge. You can espalier them. Make them any shape you want. Just want to make sure that you prune them before the end of May, as with most plants, so that they can grow and set their flowers for the next season. Okay, moving on. This is another new plant for us, Sarcoca ruscifolia. A lot of people are familiar with the little short Sarcoca Cumulus, but it has the same traits in the sense that it's evergreen, loves the shade, dry spot, not a wet spot. It does have fragrant white flowers in early spring, but it's going to get taller. So if you needed something in a very shady location with some heights that get up, 3 to 4 feet or more, but have that nice white, fragrant, very fragrant flowers in the spring, then this will work for you. And the deer don't like this, so that's a big plus for that too. Moving on to another interesting plant. This is Edgeworthia. Zone 7 to 10. It can grow in zone 6 in protected areas. Kind of tropical looking, big leaf. Those leaves will all fall off, turn kind of yellow, and then the flower buds are just starting to form now, and then they start blooming midwinter many times, and they have those nice little yellow clusters of flowers. It's called a paper bush because as it gets older, the bark will kind of peel off in paper thin sheets. As with Daphne, you do not want this plant to stay wet, particularly in the wintertime. Whenever I sell a Daphne plant, I always ask the person to grab the stem and squeeze it. It's firm, but it's a little softer than you would expect a shrub to be. And many people go, well, it reminds me of a succulent. And I say, yeah, treat it as such. Once they're in ground in the right spot, they just don't need any extra water. Because if they do, a lot of times they'll just rot right off and you'll lose the plant. The plant will be up on top, but the roots will be gone. You don't want that to happen. All right. This is one of my favorite plants. I'm glad we finally got this in. The first time I saw this was in Fremont, California, at Reading Nursery, where I used to work. And Osmanthus fragrans is sometimes called sweet olive, blooms in the fall, has white flowers, very fragrant. Deer don't like Osmanthus at all. This one here has the orange flowers and has a different fragrance. And obviously I was influenced by the orange color, but when I smell it, it reminds me of a more fruity fragrance. And I say, well, it smells like an apricot, which I prefer. I like apricots. So this can be a nice good sized shrub for you. It does. Now here's the interesting thing. Well, I've got up there zone 8 through 11 or 7 through 10. I did that because when I did a search for it to get some more accurate information, this is what I found out. It depends who you talk to. And so you do just be aware. But as I said, we have been only zone 7, like 4 years out of the 19. So that's the fun part about being here, is that you can, play a little risky thing, plant something that might not be technically a zone 7, but probably will work for you for quite a few years, especially if you pay attention to the weather and do that extra protection when you need to. Moving on to the next slide, another fairly new plant for us, Turnstromia. A lot of people call this Japanese claria. There is actually a Japanese claria. I don't think it looks as nice as Turnstromia. I've got the picture of the plant, and a lot of them have a coppery tone to the foliage. A lot of them have been selected for that copper reddish tone, kind of shiny leaf. Then you see the little white flowers, and then you see that. Then there's the fruit. The fruit happens in the fall. First time I saw a big one of these out here was on the Eastern Shore, which is technically zone 8. But they were in the shade for a good portion of the day because it was next to a gymnasium. But I've seen them around here doing quite well. And like I said, the worst case scenario usually is that they'll get some winter burn, which is called winter pruning, actually, and that'll help keep the plant maybe from getting too big. Lakes part sun, sun to part shade. Then we're going to get into some fun ones here. On the left is a banana, but that's Musa Baju, the Japanese fiber banana. It was actually selected for its fiber to be used to make twine and string and clothing and rough material and fishnets and such. And it can go down to zone 5. Now, of course, the top isn't going to survive. The top will always freeze in most cases, but it's the tuber at the base that survives. I had one here for quite a few years down by a pond, and some years I did some protection, other years I did not. And I think it failed in 17 when we had that wind, and it was too exposed. And I think the wind literally just sucked the moisture out of what was left of it. But I've talked to people that have them here, do real well. I've seen some in my old neighborhood, and you leave them in the ground, they just pop back up. If you want to protect the trunk, which is actually pseudo trunk, it's just part of the leaf, you can go ahead and cut the top off after the first frost, and then put a big cage around it, fill it full of a bunch of leaves, and you can keep that trunk so it'll get taller for you next year. Bananas are an herb, and as they grow, they eventually flower. Once they initiate the flower, that section of the plant is going to die, and what you're looking for is pups that come up on the side to replace the plant. So if you like a tropical effect, now in this picture, what's interesting is if you look off to the left, upper left, that is a white pine. So we know that plant is growing in a fairly cool, normally cold winter environment. Right on the plant on the right is Calocasia, which is called elephant ear. Again, 7B to 10. Other places say 9 to 10. I've had one here for a number of years, and I did protect it. I would put some leaves over the top and put a old container on top of that, stuff it full of leaves. The main thing is that I also wanted to make sure that it wasn't wet through the wintertime. And I think that's what happened this last winter when I lost it. The soil stayed too wet, and the cold got in there with the water. You keep it on the drier side, cold air can move through water and moisture, but if the soil is drier, that dry soil helps to insulate the root or the tuber. On to the next slide. This one here is Fatsia Japonica. A lot of people use it as a house plant. This particular one's called spiderweb. It has a white webby like variegation on the leaf. And if you look closely at that label, it says zone 8 through 10, but we'll go quickly to me and this label from the very same company. I don't know if you can see it. No, it's faded out. Sorry, but this particular one says zone 7 through 9. So as I said before, we'll go back. You always give it a try. And this is a shade-loving plant. Definitely want to keep it in the shade. I have one in a container, made it through the last 2 winters just fine, but we've been on the mild side. Some people are predicting it to be colder this winter. So I'll have to watch the weather, and I might have to wrap it up or shove it closer to the house and have it hopefully make it through the wintertime. If you keep the root base, the soil, the trick is keeping the soil from freezing if you can. You can lose the entire top on a lot of these plants, but then they'll just re-sprout from the base. I've talked to people that have crepe myrtles further north where they're not supposed to grow. And what they do is they treat them as perennials. They wait for the leaves to fall off. They chop the whole thing down, use all the parts that they chopped off, put it on top of the root zone, pile some more stuff on top, maybe even put like a plastic cover up to keep the water out of it. And then they pull that off in April, let that sun get in there and warm it up. And then they have it regrows from the roots every year and blooms late in the season for them. Moving on to some other iffy plants around here. This is Dracaena indivisa, what people call spikes. The one on the right, the green one, that's been there for over 2 years. I have protected it both years, just to be on the safe side, because I've actually been able to keep the trunks on them. The trunk on this one is almost 18 inches tall now. It was planted as a little 4-inch plant. And I've always been surprised. When I first moved here, I did talk to some friends at church, and he was saying, oh yeah, I put my spikes in my pots and just leave them there all winter. If they make it through the wintertime, that's great. If they don't, I just replace them. So again, there's a little dilemma here. Some places say 9 through 10 and obviously 7 through 11. I would maybe fudge and say it's a definite zone 8 plant. You can get some winter burn, and that's something you have to be aware of. Any of your plants is that, again, saying something grows in a particular zone doesn't mean it's not going to look bad after the winter. It's just that it's going to recover and then perform for you during the regular season. And going on to the last of our slides. So this is canna lily. I've grown canna lilies in the ground here and done nothing to them, and they survive for a number of years, and then maybe we get a cold winter. They freeze out, but you can get new tubers pretty quickly. If I did more protection on it, then it'd probably do a better job. The plant on the right is your bird of paradise, Strelitzia regina. And I just showed that because someone did plant one out here at Miracle Garden Center for Oaks. I'm going, oh, that's interesting. That's going to be interesting to see how it makes it through the wintertime, because it's listed definitely as zone 10. And so I know they can take a light frost from being in California, but they definitely won't take a hard freeze. So it's going to be kind of fun to see what happens with that plant. I think I'm going to, if I get a chance, to do some major insulation on it to see if we can get it through the wintertime. So I ran through that pretty fast, I guess, but one thing I want to show you was things like for winter protection. You can use any container. This is what I was doing for the Calicasia and for the Dracaena. I would put leaves around the base of it, then stuff that through leaves and shove the whole plant, the pot on top. That kept it nice and tight. Not too attractive, but it did a good job. Also, we saw these wires. You'll see them mostly used for pansies to keep deer off. What they do is they put them in the ground and they put the deer netting over them to keep the deer off the pansies. But you can also use these around one of your plants instead of using a container. Get several of these, put them around, and then put your frost blanket over the top of it, maybe with some clips or something like that to keep everything in place. The other thing, like I said, you can use about anything you want. Cardboard boxes work well, especially for a few extra nights, as long as it doesn't rain too much. And to show you that where we are in this zone, I have mulched my yard all the time, heavily, because that's what I was used to growing up. And the other 2 years ago, my fibrous begonias made it through. Several of them made it through the winter, and I was quite surprised as I pulled the mulch away. They had already started popping up, and they grew the next year. 1 year I had calibrachoa, which people call them little million bells. Had that in a pot for the summertime. Of course, it froze. I thought, okay, forget about it. Don't worry about it till next year. And it was on the north side of the house. It was in the shade all winter. And getting in my car one spring morning, I saw that it started to grow. I said, oh, that's cool. I made it. So I put it out in the sun and it did fine the rest of the year. So that just shows you how variable our winters can be. So it's really important that you, as winter progresses, that you pay attention to not only what's happening today and tomorrow, but maybe a 10-year plan, a 10-day plan. Last winter, I'm watching, and it threatened to be down in the low teens. It never happened that here. It slowly crept up every day. I watched it. It went from 11 to 13 to 15 to 19, and so we didn't get to zone 7 this year. We were definitely a zone 8 again this year. So yes, we'll open it to questions if anybody has any.
Yeah, all right. Well, Paul, thank you. We've had questions coming in, so I'll start getting to those in just a minute. Before we start with questions, quick reminder to everybody. We've got about 20 minutes that we can use for questions right now. If we have a ton of questions come in and we're not able to get to all of them, you can always hit reply on your confirmation emails. That goes directly to me, and we can check in with Paul later, send you to the plant clinic, wherever you need to go to get some help. So we're happy to answer any questions, even if we can't get to all of them. So just want to give out that reminder. Having said that, let's dive in. Paul, our first question is about how you wrapped the plants. Diana wanted to know, how many layers of burlap should you use when you're wrapping the plants? Is there a set amount, or how do you determine that?
That's a good question. Kind of depends on your plant and your location. One layer would be sufficient to help reduce the wind issue. We're really talking wind issue. Growing up on the West Coast, I grew up around figs and stuff and didn't have to worry about it, but I did start reading about, I read in Horticulture magazine and organic and gardening and farming, and hearing about, oh, these people are wrapping their figs up, and and they wrap them up a lot. They put many, many layers of burlap on them, really thick. And I just read an article just a little bit ago, and they had done actually sort of an experiment with it and checked things. And it was always perceived that it was insulating the plant to keep it from getting too cold per se. But what they really discovered, what it's doing is they're waiting again until it gets cold, then they wrap it. And what it does is it prevents fluctuation of temperatures. So when it gets cold, that's okay, because they're not growing it in a zone that the plant can't technically survive in a sense. Not growing it in upper New York. It's all along Long Island and along the coast and all the way down. And so what they found was that if you didn't wrap it up, and I've seen this myself, where the radiant, we have a nice sunny day, it can be 28 degrees outside, but that radiant heat is warming up the tissue that is exposed to the sun, and then it gets down to 19 degrees that night. And what can happen is it causes a heat fluctuation in the plant, and it gets confused about what time of year it is, and then that's when you get damaged. But if you wrap it up and don't let the sun get to it, then it keeps it nice and cool, even temperature, and you don't have that problem. So it's better probably to do more layers than less. But, you know, like I said, I think I mentioned this, when you drive north out of here up into the Pennsylvania stuff, and you see where they wrap up their boxwood to protect them from the snow and or cold, they're probably wrapping them once to twice up there. And that should be sufficient. Again, it's mainly keeping the wind off of it.
Got it. Okay. Okay, next question is about hydrangeas. Timothy says, I planted a hydrangea a few years ago. It hasn't flowered. It looks good in the spring, but as the summer wears on, it loses leaves and looks like it's dying. Okay, so it gets harder to late afternoon sun. Can he move it to a spot that gets more shade? Do you have any thoughts on what you do with hydrangeas if they're not flowering?
Well, he can move it without a problem. I learned that a long time ago. The worst thing that's going to happen is it's going to die. Okay, you can always move a plant. Okay, well, because if you don't move it, it's not working for you, or it's going to die. You're putting a patio in, or whatever. People ask me that. Can I move it because I'm putting a patio in? Sure, move it. Worst case, it's going to die. It's going to die anyhow. But the thing about not blooming, I don't know if this is your situation or not, but again, you've got to have branches that grew from the previous season to have any blooms on it the next spring. So I think it was last year I had a couple come in and they've had a hydrangea for 4 or 5 years. Gorgeous plant, beautiful, big. It would grow up to be 3 or 4 feet every year, never bloomed. And when I was going through all the scenarios, we've had some cold winters and blah, blah, blah. And I started mentioning about pruning. And when you read about macrophylla hydrangeas pruning job, they talk about pruning in midsummer, take out the flowers as they fade to cause new growth to appear, because that's where the flowers are going to be next year. But I would do that in hydrangea country, not up here. Okay, hydrangea country is where you don't have to do any winter protection. There's no dieback. So what we're talking about here, or all the plants we're talking about, is this is not hydrangea macrophylla country. It's not loropetalum country. It's not gardenia country. But we can grow them here. They're just going to do a little bit different, and you may have to do some protection on them. They might not bloom as long. Like I mentioned before, I've never seen hydrangea macrophyllas survive the tips. What happened was, as I talked about pruning, the husband backed away from his wife and myself about 3 or 4 feet, and then confessed that because during fall cleanup, he was cutting his hydrangea down close to the ground, because he thought in fall cleanup, you should be pruning your shrubs. And I told him kind of flat out, you do not prune anything in the fall of your shrubs. Fall cleanup is removal of foliage on the ground. And so they go, oh. So hopefully that resolved that problem. Hydrangeas can grow in the sun. The thing is, the leaves are going to be smaller. They're going to be less green. They may bloom with more flowers, but the flowers are going to fade faster. They also have a tendency to wilt when the sun hits them, and people panic and they water them. But what's happening is that the heat, direct sun heat, is causing moisture to leave the foliage faster than the plant can pick it up out of the ground. And as soon as the sun goes away, they usually perk right back up. So that's why usually people put hydrangeas in at least midday shade, and they don't have that wilting problem.
Got it. Okay. I'm gonna skip ahead to a question that's come in that we get a ton of questions on, so I think this is an important one to make sure we address. It's two parts. The first is, how do you know that a plant has died and is not salvageable after the winter? The next question is, at what point is the weather severe enough to start wrapping these plants? Is there like a set temperature?
So the first one, easy enough to do, is to, like I mentioned before, you want to scrape the bark, and you want to start at the top and then work your way down to the root. Okay, because a lot of times your plant, you might lose 3/4 of your plant, but then the last quarter is still alive. And with most of the plants we talked about, that's all you really care about. Then you cut it back, and then it reflushes from down on that live tissue, and you got your plant again. Just what I call it natural pruning. It's, helps prevent it from getting too large, where a lot of people complain, well, this plant got too big. Well, how long have it been in the ground? 20 years. Great. Well, that means it just kept getting bigger. The other one about time frame, like I mentioned before, at least in this area, our temperatures are usually warm enough all the way through into the end of traditional holiday season around late December, that you don't really have to do anything until about that time. And what I watch for is more consistent cold temperatures. If we're going to be getting down into upper 20s for all these plants, it's not a problem. If you're getting down into the mid to lower 20s, and if it's a night or two, usually shouldn't be a problem. But if it's going to be every night down at like 21, 22 for the projected next couple of weeks, that's where I would think about, I'm going to go ahead and do some insulation on the ground, and at least that. And I've even piled leaves up inside the evergreen plant. People go, what about the leaves? Well, they don't care because it's so cold, they're not doing anything anyhow. So you can cover up a green plant completely, put it in the dark, and in the wintertime, it's going to be fine. So you just have to watch the weather, really. Temperature, yeah, that's pretty much it.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. Well, that's great information, because then they know that's what the question was. Do we need to, anytime it's below 30, it sounds like you can wait a little longer and just make sure it's going to be.
Again, like if I've grown citrus in containers, and I had to make through the wintertime by leaving them outside, but we weren't that cold. But if it was going to be, again, in the upper 20s, just to be on the safe side, I did put something over the top. It kind of depends on your plant. If you're working with plants that are supposed to grow in zone 7 and survive, then I wouldn't be that worried about it. But if you're growing something that's in a zone 8 or whatever, then you have to do it at a warmer temperature.
Okay, so it sounds like that's kind of general rule of thumb. And then if you're not sure about your specific type of plant, maybe talk to you or someone at the garden center. That sounds good. Okay, next question. Do you for canna lilies in the winter, what do you do with those? Do you insulate them or?
Yeah,
Okay.
I had dahlias come back. I didn't expect the dahlia to come back. We got 2 different colored dahlias, planted them. One was white and one was purple. And I just didn't want to take the time to dig them up out of the ground, which you can do, and overwinter the tubers. I said, well, we can just buy new ones next year. Well, I didn't do anything major to the area. I did put leaves over the area like I normally do. And to my surprise, the purple one came back for 2 years. But then we got cold enough that it did freeze out. So what was the question?
Do you how do you care for canna lilies to make sure they're
well, same thing on the cannas is now with cannas, it's like the banana. It has a tube of rhizome. So I just wait till the first freeze to kind of knock out the foliage, chop it down, and then chop it up into pieces. And I'd use the canna leaves and stem itself to put right on top of it where the tuber is, and then maybe put more leaves on top of it.
Got it. Okay.
And that's another heat-loving plant. So again, you pull it off in 1st of April, and it's not probably going to grow until late April, early May, but it's got to accumulate heat. That's another reason you want to have that soil exposed, no mulch on top of it at that time to get that plant activated. You can also dig up. They multiply so fast that some people will, dig up a small section and just put it in a container somewhere and put it in the basement or in their garage or something like that. And it doesn't have to have any light. If you just keep it cool above freezing, then it can overwinter that way. And then if the whole thing dies out, you can replant those.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Paul. Okay. Sorry, I've got a couple of questions coming out. Just type in. Okay. Next question is about camellias. We want to plant camellias and seem to live in a 6B to 7 zone. We know to be careful of which kind we pick to plant. However, we also have lots of deer. Do you have a good suggestion for deer? And I am going to make a quick note here before I give this to you, Paul. We have gotten, Pat Riley does a presentation on deer resistant plants. For anyone interested, I know I've been mentioning we're going to try and have someone in to do that class. She's doing it for us on November 8th. So whole class on deer resistant plants coming up. Signups will be up soon. So do you have a camellia recommendation that is deer resistant?
No.
No. Okay. That's too bad.
Though, I mean, it all depends on your deer pressure. They will eat camellias, but it's not their favorite. And so, and your deer population alters. I mean, when I first came here, we didn't have a deer problem because the herd all died off because they jumped off a cliff onto 29. And so we have a deer problem for the longest time. Now we have a really bad deer problem because the population's raised up again. Though forget about the deer, which recommendation for you is you want to go with anything that's a hybrid. Most of the all the camellias we get in here that are, if they're hybrids, we usually say Camellia X, or if they have the word winter in them, something like that. Those were bred for cold hardiness. I can't remember when it was. It was back in the 60s or something like that. The whole Camellia collection at the Arboretum, there were 2 consecutive winters that were like well below zero. And the first year, some of them died, a lot died back, but they go, great, they're going to regrow, which they did. But because they're putting out such soft tissue, the next winter was the same temperature and knocked out like 99% of the collection, except for one camellia that just sat there and bloomed like crazy. They took that, crossed it with all the other camellias, and come up with all these more cold hardy forms. That is something I want to quick mention is, especially when you buy a new plant, that we're going to example of it. Well, we'll take this Stillium right here. You can see this nice copper tone growth. This is new growth. This is what it looks like in the springtime. I will not expect, even if we're zone 8, I would not expect this foliage to make it through the wintertime because this is soft tissue. It hasn't hardened enough. What you're looking at here is when you see the more just the plain green foliage, okay, that's hardened off. That should make it through the wintertime without any issue if it's a correct zone. So if you push your plants with water and fertilizer and they keep growing through the summertime, you're going to have some issues with some of that stuff is going to not make it through the wintertime. So that's another point for not watering your plants once they're established. The first year, winter is going to be your biggest issue because it has such a small root ball. It's going to be easier to freeze that root ball if it does get cold enough for that. And that's another reason insulation is important, even on new plants, even if we're not expecting a harsh winter. It's just an easy thing to do. Wait till into December, get some stuff underneath your plant. But remember, take that off in the springtime. We don't want mulch mounds around our plants.
Got it. Yes. Okay, next question. Okay, what was the name of the wire that you showed you were bending to put over the shrub that goes over the pansies? Is that just a wire, or does that have like a name?
No, it doesn't really have a name. It's just nice. We call it a wire hoop here.
Okay, got it.
It's called a wire hoop.
Wire hoop.
Yeah, it's good enough gauge that it's strong enough that it'll support stuff, but easy enough to bend.
Yeah, I know. I've seen those all over. Okay, here's another product question. Can you please list the covers that we sell at Merrifield that you mentioned at the beginning? Is there one that's thickest or ones oh, you've got them right there. Perfect.
Several choices. This brand is a DeWitt, and it's just called DeWitt Insulated.
Insulate. Okay. Insulate. I'll send that out to chat for everybody.
That comes in that, and then the other one is just it's called Frost Blanket, and that's it's thicker. And you can leave these on all winter if you want to, unless we maybe get a warm 65, 70 degree day. The harvest guards, which are thinner, are used during the summertime to keep insects off, or mainly to keep insects off plants. But it does keep it a little warmer. But you want to make sure it is securely fastened to the ground. If you're using a plastic item, you don't want it to be totally enclosed. I did talk to a gentleman a number of years ago, and he had Gardenias, and I asked him how they're doing. He goes, "Oh, they're great. After winter, I got some brown leaves on them, but then they start to grow, and I get flowers in late June, July, and early August. That's fantastic." But then he mentioned that he talked to another person, and she puts like an little umbrella, a plant umbrella over her gardenias, and he tried it that winter. And he put a plant umbrella over one, which we don't sell, over one and not the other. What happened was the one he put the plant umbrella over didn't brown out as much and started blooming earlier. The important thing is that umbrella did not go to the ground. There's a gap all the way around, so it doesn't heat up underneath that plastic umbrella. Okay.
Okay. Oh, got it. So that didn't cause the heat issue that you were talking about.
Yeah. I forgot about Willproof. Willproof is a polymer. It's a polymer. You spray it on your plant. You can use it for new plantings anytime. A lot of people mainly buy it in the wintertime to spray on their plants it reduces water loss out of the plant, keeps them from dehydrating, and it will eventually wear off. It's non-toxic for the plant, but you can spray that on your, especially your newly planted, we'll call them iffy plants, to help keep them from dehydrating through the wintertime. Okay.
Yeah, I was just talking to David Yost about that a couple days ago. Okay, let's see. I'm trying to get through. We have more questions, I think, than we're going to be able to get to. One was, do you recommend wilt proof? Yes. Let's see. Okay, here's a question. Just to reiterate, you never prune in the fall. That's the question.
Okay, pruning.
Complicated
What?
question. I said, I know that's kind of a complicated question.
Right. Things to remember is, for most plants, pruning November through May causes new growth. And that's what a lot of people want. You want to prune things back, and you get a flush of new growth in the springtime. Pruning in June, July, August reduces or eliminates any new growth. Okay. So you can do pruning in the fall, but the only pruning I would do in the fall are if you see any broken dead branches or something like that, something that just doesn't need to be there. If the plant's too tall, especially if it's one, you could thin it out a little bit. But anything that's a spring blooming plant, anytime you prune any part after the middle of summer, you're taking flowers off. You can always wait until spring on your spring blooming plants, and then right after the bloom, you can prune them as much as you want, pretty much, and they'll just flush back up. I've taken azaleas that were 2 feet tall and took them down to 4 inches, and they come right back up. Okay. There are what I call waivers. You'll have your plant, and here's your basic plant, but there's always these couple of little branches that stick above everybody, and that's why I call them waivers. They're just waving at you. You can go in and take those out anytime you want. You can always bring them in and put them in the house in a vase for decorative purposes.
Got it. Yep.
Which is a great time. Pruning, like I said, November, you can go in and do thinning cuts. That's what you prefer on plants, so you don't end up having a box plant. You would take your plant that has these waivers out here, and I want to reduce my plant. Then I'm going to go in and go deep into the plant and take this whole branch out, which I just did by mistake. So I'll just cut it out now. And by taking that out, you've evened the plant out, you've reduced it in size, and now you have a branch that you can bring inside the house with your other clippings and use them for greenery. So pruning that November, December time to reduce the size of your plant, to prune deep inside, so Frank next door is not going to see that you pruned your plant, because if you prune it, which most people do without knowing it, is they do this. Now I just cut straight across. I cut across leaves, I cut across stems. There's weird stems sticking out, and that's going to look like that all winter. Not very attractive. But if you do thinning cuts, you don't see the cut. New growth is going to appear from deep inside instead of here, which then just makes the plant denser on the top. Okay.
All right, that's great. All right, we got time for we'll take one more question. I'm sorry, guys, we're not going to be able to get everybody, but please follow up with me by email. You just hit reply on your confirmation email. Last question. For the frost barriers, do you need to remove those during the day, or do you keep them on if it's going to freeze several days in a row? Do you keep them on throughout that entire period, or do you need to remove them and put them back on?
On the frost blankets, they can stay on.
Okay.
Okay. If you're using heavier material, like blankets and stuff, if you're using heavier material, you're going to need to get some stout stakes, put them in the ground, and then put the covering on those so they don't crush the plant, especially if you're expecting snow. A lot of people think snow's bad. Snow is an insulator.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so when it snows here and I'm going out and shoveling my walkway, I actually throw the snow onto my plants for 2 reasons. Because usually it can't snow when it's really, really cold. It just usually doesn't snow when it's really cold. Like I'm talking below 20, below 10. Doesn't that? It happens in that 35 to even 40 degree temperature. Sometimes you'll see snow coming down, but it's cold upstairs. But by putting that snow on my plants and even covering them up, because a lot of times after we get snow, it gets cold. and that helps protect them from that. Plus, the other thing is, as that snow melts, it's watering my plant instead of chucking it out in the street. I want that water on my plant to get that water bank in my soil for my plant for the rest of the year.
That's a good idea. Yeah. Oh man. Okay. I'm sorry, guys. We are not going to be able to get to every question today, but thank you all so much for sending all of these in. Please, again, feel free to follow up with us. I will be following up by email tomorrow to send you all your coupon. And a link to the recording of this class if you want to go back and check out some information again. Paul, thank you so much for doing this class for us. I really appreciate it. Do you have anything you want to close or wrap up with before we end the webinar?
No.
No. Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much, everybody. I appreciate you all as always joining us. And we will have some information coming out about David's plant clinic this week soon, and some other. I'll have that. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself here. We will have information on the deer resistant class that everybody's been asking for coming up soon. So thank you all so much and have a great day. Bye, Paul, and everybody else.